so I'll try to make it work. I'm reminded of my first missionary trip overseas with Pastor Mike, 2008 to the Philippines. And Pastor Mike, we were trying to set up the schedule. We were preaching in Baguio. We were sitting there trying to do the lineup of who was going to go after Pastor Mike. And us young preachers, we're all kind of arguing. I remember Belinda was with me and a number of other ones, and we were all kind of, and Sister Belinda Kawai was there. We're all kind of arguing. Nobody wanted to follow him because he's such a powerful speaker. And I feel I'm in the same position right now. After all this powerful speeching from Sean and Jurg and Joseph and everybody, I feel like, what do I have to bring? So, and in fact, it is kind of a letdown, I suppose, because everyone's talking about God, and if somebody had asked me, well, what message do you want to bring? I was like, I want to talk about the love of Jesus. I want to talk about the heart of Jesus. But Pastor Mike said, no. He said, I want you to come and talk about your theme, America's contract with God. So I said, okay, if that's what you want, that's what I'll do. And I kind of want to apologize because I have to switch from all this wonderful talk of ministry to give you kind of a history lesson. So for that, I apologize, but let's get into it and be fun. Now, I'm actually going to go exactly from this little handout that I made. We made copies for everybody. You can take some with you. And we're not going to hand it out now because I don't want to distract you, but take some with you, and I'm just going to go directly from what this says. Is the PowerPoint working? It's on. What do we talk about? America's contract, I'll just tell you before we begin, America's contract with God was something I did as my master's thesis when I was pursuing my master's degree. I was in the very first graduating class from Promise Christian University, August 16, 2003. And I was the very first class, and I've been a big, huge supporter of Promise ever since. And I guess people remember that. And I did preach on this for a number of years, but I haven't actually spoken on it in probably over 10 years. So it was kind of a relearning for me to get into it, to discuss it. The theory behind what's going on over there, the theory behind America's contract with God is the fact that throughout history, God has had a divine plan for God's people to contract with God's people time and time and time again. And I don't know if I should continue or wait. I don't know.
Sorry, the format's going to be a little messed up because you couldn't get this to me.
Share a little bit about yourself.
Oh, did you already see
Well,
Oh, it's not that one.
Bob Grant. I mentioned that I'm a lawyer. I did work as a judge for some time, but that's very boring stuff. I am a lawyer and a Christian.
I'm my lawyer.
Been a lawyer to a lot of people. I had originally, I spent, this is hard to explain. You're going to think I'm 90 years old. I spent 23 years in the Army, and I spent 21 years as a police officer for Los Angeles Police Department, and then left that and retired from that and met Pastor Mike, and it was a spiritual thing. It was really, truly a thing from God. The Holy Spirit drew me to him one day, and it's been a great blessing to me. He's been my spiritual father and mentor for 20 years, we first met 20 years ago. And it's interesting, I have been working as a defense attorney for roughly about 10 years, representing insurance companies. And for about a year, God spoke to me and told me, I want you to stop doing this and go open your own office. And I was afraid, and I actually would not. I knew God, Jesus was speaking to me. I knew Jesus was saying, go do it, go do it. I will bless you, I'll protect you, I will be with you. And I was afraid. I was afraid to follow. But finally, I remember him telling me that in July of 2011, and I refused, and I refused, and I refused. I always remember seasons and years are difficult. But finally, after about January 2012, I said, yes, okay, God, I'll do it. And so I quit, just cold turkey, working as a defense firm, making lots and lots of money, and opened my own office, and Michelle was my secretary, and we opened the office with nothing. We rented an office, and we went to the office, and there were no files. I don't know what we did. We went to the office every day.
You were teaching us.
But I can tell you that, I can tell you this, that and that was in 2012, and in the last 7 years, we've settled over 200 cases, about 200 probably, and we've never lost a single case. We win every single case. I'll be honest, I wish I'd be more humble than I am. I'm a good lawyer. I'm very good at what I do. But I can also tell you this. I pray for my clients. I raise holy hands and pray over them. And they come in, and some of them, we got Jesus is all over the office.
Oh,
and
yeah.
all my clients know that I'm a Christian minister and that I love Jesus. And they come to me and they ask me for prayer. And a lot of my clients, they come to me very sick and injured, and they have been looking forward to getting really big settlements for being sick and injured. And I say, you know what? I'm going to pray that you get healed. You're better off to be healed than to get a big settlement of money. And we do that. And I had a client last week, and I raised holy hands, and I put my hands on him and prayed for him. And I said, you know what? I'm praying that you really get healed. I want you to get healed. And in the alternative, if you don't, then God bless him with a good settlement compensation for the injuries that won't heal. And that's the way we treat our ministry. I hope the clock person isn't taking my time away. Okay, I got 20 minutes. Hey. Are we ready? Oh, look, we're getting really close there. All right, well, let's go ahead. I think this thing's working. Let's go ahead and begin. As I said, I think this is prescient now because today we hear in the media this concept that America is in what's called post-Christianity. We are a post-Christian nation, and I reject that. That's totally not true. We are not a post-Christian nation. That's nothing more than the enemy talking because they seize control of the media. But we are a nation based on family and our churches and our belief in God. And the Christian nation we have is because of the fact that we have a contract with God. You see, God had a divine plan that throughout all of history that he would reach to his people and make contracts with them. And contracts is something I know a little bit about because I've actually taught contracts many times in law school as a law professor. And I can tell you that God has contracted with his people, and he continues to want to contract. And we see it throughout history. The first one I'll point to is Abraham. God approached Abraham and said to Abraham, you know, that if you leave your father, if you leave your home, if you have faith in me, the one only true God, and you go where I tell you to go, that I will make you the father of many nations, a nation and many nations, and the nations will be multiplied because of you. And he followed that, and that was a contract that he followed, and because of that, God blessed him very, very richly, and made him, you know, a hugely prosperous and successful man. And that was the first contract. The second one is Moses. Moses entered into many transactions with God, and you'll see this in Genesis, or correction, in Exodus. And when he entered into those contracts with God, it began with God saying, Moses, you lead my people out of Egypt. You lead them out of Egypt, and I will prosper them. And he said, I will take them out of slavery. He said, and I will give them the land that was promised to Abraham and to Isaac. He said, not only that, this is in Psalm 105. He says, not only that, he said, I will take them out without any injuries and with good health. And they left Egypt with the treasures of Egypt with them, the gold and the silver. So those are the beginning of the contracts. We'll see additional contracts as well. For example, Joshua. God said to Joshua, I will make you the same promises I made to Moses. And wherever you go, wherever you put your foot, I learned this from Sister Mila, wherever you put your foot, wherever you occupy, that will be God's territory, and it will belong to me. And you will have the same promises. And they went forward and they occupied, and they got back the homeland, the nation of Israel. God continued to do that with King Solomon. And we see this where he came to King Solomon and he said in his prayers, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. He didn't just limit his contracts to the people of Israel, but he said to Jonah, go to the people in Assyria, go to Nineveh, he said, and preach to them. And he did, and when he preached to the people of Nineveh, they turned from their evil ways and they accepted God, and God decided to spare them and not to destroy them. And these divine plans for humankind are also described not only through the promises that God made regarding the people of Israel, but he also described it with regard to what he was going to do in the future with regard to other nations as well. He writes in 1 Chronicles, sing to the Lord all the earth, ascribe to the Lord, O families of nations. And then in Hosea he wrote the word of God, I will call those who were my people, and her who was not beloved, beloved. And he says, you will call me God, you will be my people, and you will call me God. And he's talking about other nations. And you'll find that actually, it's in, where is that? I've lost my track. But he goes on to say in Isaiah 42:1, he says that the Redeemer will come and be the light to the world, to all the ends of the earth, and that he will be a light to the Gentiles. And that's one of the first references where we see where God has a plan not only for the nation of Israel, but also for other nations of the world. And then finally, Jesus gives his charge in Matthew 28:19. And I've heard this twice already in the last 2 days. In Matthew 28:19, Jesus says, go forward and make disciples of what? Not of people, of nations. Of nations. And so Jesus said that all nations can be discipled and can be nations as well. And that's the basis for the notion that nations can contract with God. And my position today, what I'm here to tell you, is that America did contract with God very, very explicitly and very deliberately.
That's right.
And it began going back to Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent colony. It might be easier if I read that up there. And the first permanent colony was in Jamestown, Virginia, where when they first stepped off the boat, the very first thing they did was to erect a cross and to have a prayer meeting. And it was actually recorded what they said in that prayer meeting. They said, men's affairs do not prosper if prayer is neglected. Oh, look at that. I'll try to go without it if I can, because I do have my own notes. It's actually a little bit hard to see over here, so let's see if I can do this. All right. And then when the Pilgrims came over in 1620, they contracted with God with an express written contract, the Mayflower Compact. And in the Mayflower Compact, this is kind of interesting. If you try to read it today, you can't even read it. Someone talked about languages earlier, yesterday and today, regarding languages. If you try to read it, you can't read it. We actually have to hire certified translators to translate it because the Middle English is so different for us to understand these days, it has to be translated. But when you translate it, it says this. It says that they were to undertake for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith to establish a colony. Daniel Webster, the great 19th century orator, declared that the Pilgrims of Plymouth Rock were brought here for their veneration for the Christian religion and journeyed by its light and labored by its hope. When the colony started, they developed things that were called charters and constitutions. Now, these are the colonies before the states actually formed. And in there, they also profess their dedication and reliance on God. For example, the Connecticut colony wrote in its original constitution, according to God, to maintain the liberty and the purity of the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. And in Rhode Island's charter, they required that the colony's peoples submitted their lives and their estates unto the Lord Jesus Christ and to the perfect and absolute laws of Jesus Christ given in his holy work. There was a poll taken, moving now up to about the time of the Revolution. There was a poll taken at the time of the Revolution that showed that 98.4% of Americans were Protestant at the time. And now we get into some really, really interesting things. The Declaration of Independence, which I call America's birth certificate, declared in that Declaration of Independence. Now this is very interesting. They did a survey last year, I believe. Some of you might have seen that, where they took excerpts from the Declaration of Independence and they showed it to people and asked them what they thought. And they said, that's outrageous, that's un-American. No, it's what was written in the Declaration of Independence. But people's minds have been so molded now by false things and false history, they don't even know what their own history is. But the Declaration of Independence actually says that the purpose was to conform America's affairs to the Maker, with a capital N. The Declaration stated that America needed God's approval to be a nation and relied on God's protection to exist. The history of America in the church, in the schools, is very interesting. The foremost authority on the history of American schools was Elwood P. Coverley. I love that name, it sounds so English. And Elwood Coverley wrote that almost every school in every village, town, and city was operated by the community church, and all children learned to read Christian materials in the classroom for the purpose of learning the will of God for their lives. There's a false claim raised by anti-Christians that Thomas Jefferson had advocated a wall of separation between church and state to keep God out of the schools. A lot of people don't know what really happened. It is true that there was a letter penned that went to the Danbury Baptist churches that had used a phrase like that. And it was that phrase and that letter that was used as a basis for the Supreme Court to start legislating through the bench against the Christian church. But the truth was, Thomas Jefferson didn't even write it. His secretary, a man by the name of Levi, wrote that letter. And the truth is follows. When Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States, remember that when the presidency formed, they weren't even in Washington, D.C. The Constitution called for the capital to move to Washington, D.C. And when it moved to Washington, D.C., and President Jefferson was the first one to occupy the White House there, that he was asked by the public school district there in Washington, D.C., if he would provide study materials. And what did he provide? He provided Bibles and hymnals. So the notion that the Supreme Court clings to now to say that Thomas Jefferson wanted to create a wall of separation between church and state is just totally false. It's not true. That's not what he ever intended at all. But unfortunately, we live in a society now where sometimes untruthful things rule. George Washington, as the commander-in-chief of our military, had ordained that the military shall be a Christian army, and he ordered that its members must attend divine services. And I can tell you myself, when I was a young soldier, it's hard to believe that. When I went to officer candidate school, this is actually true, this was 1980. When I went to officer candidate school, they marched us up every Sunday morning, and they marched us in columns of two over to the Christian church, and we filed in row by row, and we sat there and listened to the preacher give a Christian message, and we were required to, or we were outside doing push-ups. And one of the drill instructors was actually a Buddhist, a devout Buddhist, but her job was to march us into the Christian church so we could get the divine message. And by the way, it wasn't a chaplain. They brought in a local Christian minister from one of the outside the base churches to come in and give us our message every Sunday morning for officer candidate school. So yes, even as late as 1980, our Army was still a very Christian organization. And I believe now they still are. I'm long since retired from the Army, but I believe they're still a very Christian organization. Not only that, the courts have always upheld throughout our history that America is a Christian nation. I'll give you some examples. Oh, no, let me go back. I'm getting ahead of myself. the state constitution, the Delaware state constitution, now this is after we formed as a nation, the Delaware state constitution required, and like many of the states, when I was writing this master thesis, I actually went back and read every state constitution at the time of the Revolution. And about half of them, I don't remember now if it was 6 or 7 or 8, but about half of them required language such as the follows. In Delaware, a candidate for public office must swear that they were a Christian professing faith in God and faith in Jesus Christ, his only Son. Now the courts have affirmed time and time again that the United States is a Christian nation. The most interesting case is the one I saw, People v. Ruggles decision in 1811. Now understand, when our country originally formed, the states had an enormous amount of power, and the state Supreme Courts actually were more prestigious than the U.S. Supreme Court. As a matter of fact, there was a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court who actually resigned from the U.S. Supreme Court to go to his state to be a member of his state Supreme Court because he thought it was more prestigious. I think it was Virginia. I forget which state it was. But anyways, the New York Supreme Court had ruled in 1811 that well, let me tell you what happened. I'll give you a little background. And I hate to say this, it's going to offend you to hear it. But there was a man by the name of Ruggles in New York who blasphemed by saying, well, he said bad things about Jesus and Mary, the worst things you can imagine. Really horrible words. And when he said those really horrible words about Jesus and Mary, he was actually arrested by the police for saying it. So they appealed it. And it went all the way up to the New York Supreme Court, and the New York Supreme Court ruled that the conviction would stand and he would go to jail because they said that the United States was, our unofficial faith was Christianity, and the United States did not endorse impostor religions such as Buddhism and Islam, and it's actually written in the court decision. The Supreme Court in 1845, in the case of Vidal v. Gerard Executors, ruled that a Philadelphia school could teach from the Bible. This is, that they could teach from the Bible because of the fact that this was a Christian nation as well. And then in the latest case was, I got my case mixed up?
No, that's good. You're fine.
I should read up there, shouldn't I? The U.S. Supreme Court held and this was an interesting case, it was the case in 1891. That was one where a British pastor had tried to come to the United States and the immigration department tried to keep him out. And the U.S. Supreme Court said no, they could not keep him out because this is a Christian nation. That was the last strong ruling regarding the Supreme Court protecting us as a Christian nation. Around the 1947 or so, around that time, they started ruling the other way until we saw some horrible decisions in the 60s, 1963 and such. So my contention is that we are a nation that's been blessed by our contract with God, and we have prospered because of it, and we've been a better nation because of it. And as a result of that, we have become the light of the world. In 200 years of history, we have been the light of the world. And you see the Statue of Liberty that represents us, and you'll see there that flame up there on the Statue of Liberty. That flame is not like a light to bring people who are their poor in the hut of masses, but it's a flame that demonstrates the light of God shining through America to the light of the world. That's what that flame is there for. And America, since we are a Christian nation, we have gone forward over and over and over again to help the world to be blessed. One of the ways we did that is by lots of inventions. And you'll see there the picture of the world with the globe on it. You see all those lights at night. All those lights exist because an American, Thomas Edison, invented the light bulb in 1879, or at least his laboratory did. But then we went forward to make many other innovations that have been very helpful to mankind, such as the sewing machine. invented in Massachusetts. Without the invention of the sewing machine, could you imagine what it was like to actually make garments, sewing them together with a needle and thread and things like that? Air conditioning, we can all think of as something that's comfortable and it helps us to live our life better. But do you know how many lives are saved every year because of air conditioning and hospitals and things like that? Every year in the United States, there's a heat wave in some city in Texas or California. And when these heat waves strike and the air conditioning breaks, we get reports of people elderly and sick who die because of the lack of air conditioning. You can see many of the other wonderful innovations that we've created. Lasers, travel to the moon, personal computer, cell phone, internet, GPS signals for our devices. But some of the most important ones we've saved to last. We also came up with disposable diapers, the electric guitar, electric videos, cotton candy, and of course, pantyhose. All American inventions. So we blessed the world in that way. But there's another way that God's influence on us has helped the Americans to bless the world. And that's the way we have sacrificed with blood and treasure. And we sacrifice that way because of our moral compass, because of our biblical principles instilled in us to be willing to sacrifice, to do the right thing, to do what God wants.
Yes.
More than 1.2 million Americans have died in fighting in wars. And more than half of those, about 620,000 in the Civil War, we call it the war between the states. And it's interesting that a lot of people will say, well, yeah, 620,000, well, maybe half of them died for defending slavery. No, that's actually not true. The war was because of slavery. That's absolutely true. And Abraham Lincoln who was a very, very devoted Christian, had said that he believed that the war between the states was God's wrath, God's vengeance on the United States for allowing the awful institution of slavery to occur. And it is true that the principal reason for the war was slavery. But understand this, those Southerners who died during the war, most of them were not defending slavery. Most Southerners never owned a slave and didn't care one way or another about it. And most of the Southerners were conscripted. No. The awful thing about the Civil War was the fact, understand that this was the enemy that did this. This was demonic. It was a demonic thing to have slavery in this country. And it was a horrible, awful wrong that had to be righted. And Americans gave their life for that. The Southerners who gave their life, like the Northerners, gave their life because they were defending their states, not because they were defending slavery. I'm sure there were some that did, but it was a terrible thing. The important thing is that when 600,000 Americans died, torn apart, it was to wrong a right that was righted. We went on in World War II. We lost 400,000 American soldiers in World War II. We entered that war after 3 years of a locked confrontation where there was a stalemate, and then we tipped the balance and we sacrificed 400,000 Americans. Eventually 70 million people died because of the evil of the Nazis and the evil that the Russians were doing and the Japanese were doing. And it was just an awful thing. But if we're not for Americans sacrificing our 400,000, to be sure many other people did too, but we tipped the balance and we made the world a better place. And if you look to some of the prosperous nations in the world now, Japan and Germany, it's because we rebuilt those countries after the war. And we did that with our Christian principles. So the last one I'll point you to is Korea. We sacrificed 33,000 American soldiers died in Korea, just like many other countries too. We weren't the only ones. God knows the Koreans lost a lot more than we did. But we did that to protect them. And if you look there, you will see the hand of God. Because let me tell you something, you visited Korea 30 times. I haven't visited Korea 30 times, but I did live there for 4 years. And my wife is Korean, and my daughter's Korean, and so I know a little bit about it. And I can tell you that Korea has always been a Christian nation. I got to wrap up soon and I'm almost done. Korea has always been a Christian nation. We were sending missionaries there in the 1870s, the 1880s, and the 1890s, and people were flocking to the faith, to adopt Christianity, and missionaries were going there. When I was a young man and I first went to Korea in 1974 as a young soldier, I went to Korean churches and heard the gospel from Korean churches. I remember going with my wife and seeing my wife sing in churches in 1984, and then had to marry her. She was so cute. But what happened was, and look at the hand of God here.
Yes.
North invaded the South, godless people with worship of one thing, their dictator. And as a result now, it was divided in half. All the Christians that could fled to the South. And what we had in the South was a nation with Christians, and the North was a country without Christians. And what's left? Abject poverty, slavery, destitute, without hope. And in South Korea, we see a model of prosperity and development. It's one of the richest countries in Asia now, all because, why? They were blessed because they have a contract with God too. There are other Christian nations as well. The Philippines is a very Christian nation. And they might not have the economic prosperity of Korea, but guess what? Year after year, they take polls, and if they take the polls in Philippines, and what do they say? They're the happiest people on earth. So they have God in their hearts. And so I'm here to tell you today, nations that accept God as their leader, that turn to God and bless God and pray to God and love God, those nations will be blessed. And so I say to you that if any nation thirsts, let them drink living waters from Jesus. If any nation hungers, let them eat the bread of life, and they will be blessed as America and Korea and Philippines have been blessed. Thank you.